Imagine waking up every day knowing that your entire existence, your family, your future, and even the flavor of the olive oil you dip your bread into is decided not by luck or honest effort, but by the cosmic equivalent of a group of perpetually drunk, incredibly powerful, and emotionally unstable toddlers throwing a tantrum on a sacred mountain. Can you believe the sheer agonizing misery of that reality? This isn't just a story about heroes battling cyclopes. This is the horror story of ancient Greece, a nightmare where the very fabric of the universe was rigged against you, the mortal, the insignificant speck of dust doomed to be collateral damage in a divine domestic dispute that stretched across millennia. We are talking about a catastrophe no one saw coming because it was already there, baked into the foundations of reality since the Titans were thrown screaming into Tartarus. Every single moment of peace was merely the lull before a celestial hurricane. You thought having a bad boss was rough? Try having Zeus, the absolute king of the gods, decide your fate based on whether he stubbed his toe that morning, or if he caught his wife Hera glaring at him over an ambrosia cocktail. Every single lightning bolt wasn't a natural phenomenon. It was a potential death warrant delivered directly to your backyard, usually because some god was having a terrible, petty day, and you just happened to be standing under the shadow of their celestial mood swing. The most terrifying, paralyzing truth about existing in the world of Greek mythology is this: being human was less about living and more about desperately trying not to attract attention. It was a high-stakes, zero-sum game of cosmic hide-and-seek where the seekers held all the power, and the penalty for being found was usually eternal torment, being flayed alive, or worse, being turned into a weeping, aesthetically pleasing shrub. Forget the concept of free will. Forget the idea that hard work pays off. Your life was an unscripted, improvised one-act play, written by an Olympian committee that often forgot your character existed until they needed a prop to make a point. And let's be clear, the gods weren't just powerful, they were capricious. They weren't just immortal, they were entirely unpredictable, motivated by base instincts that would get any mortal thrown into the village stocks: lust, jealousy, vanity, and a bottomless capacity for holding a grudge. If you were beautiful, you were a target for Zeus. If you were smart, you were a threat to Athena, or worse, an object of envy for a lesser god. If you dared to boast about anything, your weaving skills, your hunting prowess, even how lovely your children were, you had essentially signed a cosmic petition demanding swift, agonizing erasure from existence. The mortal world was less a cradle of civilization and more a massive testing ground, a theme park of suffering designed purely for the entertainment and self-affirmation of the divine residents of Olympus. You were not a participant, you were a lab rat, and the experiment was always pain. Consider the sheer terror of fate itself. In this brutal universe, fate was not an abstract concept. It was a physical, terrifying reality embodied by the three hideous, ancient fates, the Moirai, who decided the length of your life thread with utter indifference. And the worst part? Even the gods feared the fates. This meant that while Zeus could ruin your Tuesday, the Moirai dictated your entire biography, and nobody, absolutely nobody, could appeal their decision. You were born with an expiration date already stamped on your soul, and every glorious moment you achieved only served to highlight how close you were to the inevitable, often horrific ending. Think about the sheer volume of ways you could offend an Olympian without even trying. Did you forget to leave a perfectly marbled goat steak on the altar of Artemis before your morning hunt? Congratulations, you just bought yourself a date with a raging boar. Did your neighbor have slightly better crops and foolishly fail to thank Demeter loudly enough? Well, enjoy the ensuing famine that wipes out your entire district because one mortal was slightly ungrateful. The gods did not operate on human scales of justice. They operated on scales of ego satisfaction. A slight infraction demanded cosmic retribution. A simple misunderstanding required the drowning of an entire fleet. And what about the heroes, the supposed champions of humanity? Even they were nothing more than tools. Hercules spent his life cleaning up Zeus's mistakes and Hera's vengeful spite. Achilles was a beautiful, doomed weapon, whose glorious deeds were just chapter breaks in a far larger, divine political struggle. Being a hero didn't save you from suffering. It simply meant the gods found you interesting enough to torture in high definition. It meant your death would be more dramatic, your suffering more profound, all for the benefit of the eternal viewership on Olympus. The air was thick with divine interference. You couldn't trust the sea because Poseidon was moody and held grudges against entire bloodlines. You couldn't trust the harvest because Hades might be lonely and decide to kidnap the goddess of spring. You couldn't even trust your own family because the gods were notorious for disguising themselves, sleeping with a mortal, and then vanishing, leaving behind a demigod child who inevitably brought either world-shattering glory or, far more likely, world-shattering doom to everyone they ever loved. This is the true story of why Greek mortality sucked. It was a lifetime spent walking on a razor's edge, praying to indifferent, volatile beings, knowing deep down that the slightest tremor of divine boredom or rage could erase you, your city, and your entire lineage from the face of the earth without a second thought. And that, my friends, is just the beginning of the nightmare we call the Hellenic era. You see, the number one rule etched into the marble of the cosmos, the single decree you dared not violate, was this: know your place. But knowing your place was a cosmic joke, because your place was always moving, always shrinking, always under the microscope of Olympus. Try to be too good at anything, weaving, singing, running, farming, and you had already signed a death warrant written in lightning bolts. The gods weren't just powerful, they were supremely, terrifyingly insecure. If you built a better wall than they expected, if your harvest was too bountiful, if your daughter was inexplicably beautiful, some bored deity might mistake your simple human excellence for the deadliest crime of all, hubris. It wasn't enough to be humble, you had to be utterly mediocre, maybe even slightly terrible, just to stay off the radar of divine jealousy. And once that cosmic spotlight hit you, the game was over. You didn't get a trial, you didn't get an appeal, you got a consequence so disproportionate to the crime that it rewrote the history of your entire bloodline forever. This wasn't justice, it was a cosmic tantrum designed to remind the ants exactly who owned the anthill. Let's talk about the original power couple, the two anchors of mortal misery, Zeus and Hera. Being a mortal woman who caught the eye of Zeus was statistically the worst thing that could happen to you, a guaranteed one-way ticket to transformation, exile, or agonizing death. Zeus, the supposed father of all, treated consent like an amusing footnote, utilizing disguises, golden showers, or just plain brute cosmic force to get his way. And the fallout? Oh, the fallout was never directed at the philandering king of the gods. It always landed squarely on the innocent mortal woman who was merely the object of his fleeting attention. Poor Io, transformed into a white heifer and driven mad across continents, her only crime being beautiful enough to be noticed by the cosmic predator. Hera, the queen of heaven, was the architect of the slow, agonizing destruction. She was the definition of perpetual, simmering rage, a force of nature driven by righteous, yet wholly misplaced revenge. She wouldn't just kill you, she would make you suffer so profoundly that your story would become a cautionary tale whispered in the dark for 1,000 years. She targeted the offspring, the demigods, the heroes, because they were living, breathing evidence of her husband's infidelity. Imagine being Heracles, a strongman legend, but cursed with blinding fits of madness that forced him to murder his own wife and children. That was Hera's signature move, psychological warfare backed by unlimited divine power, ensuring the collateral damage was maximized and permanent. Every demigod, every child of Zeus walked around with a target painted on their back, not by some earthly enemy, but by the queen of the gods herself, whose grudge was infinite and whose executioners were relentless. You might survive the monster, but could you survive the inescapable divine paranoia that followed you everywhere? But even escaping the immediate wrath of the big two didn't mean you were safe, because Greek mythology operated on a system of terrifying, predetermined fate, usually delivered through cryptic, maddening prophecy. You might think you have free will, but you don't. You are merely an actor, reading lines from a script written millennia ago by the fates, and the moment you try to deviate, the cosmos snaps you back into place. Take the tragic King Oedipus. His father, Laius, received a clear warning: your son will kill you and marry your wife. Most people would just try to avoid having a son, right? No, they tried to dispose of the baby, hoping to cheat fate. But every single choice they made, from handing the baby off to a shepherd, to the shepherd being merciful, to Oedipus growing up in Corinth, was the exact mechanism that ensured the prophecy came true. They ran from the curse, but they ran directly into its arms. Their panicked actions were the engine of their own undoing. This is the heart of mortal terror. You are damned whether you act or not. Your existence is merely the stage upon which divine laws are proven absolute. And the fates, those three ancient, terrifying women who spun, measured, and cut the thread of life, just decided your time was up. You could be pious, humble, and utterly insignificant, and they could still snip your lifeline just because the cosmic tapestry required a blank spot right where you were standing. And don't get comfortable thinking that if you just avoided Mount Olympus, you'd be safe. The pantheon was vast, specialized, and perpetually irritable. If you lived near the sea, you had to worry about Poseidon, the earth-shaker, a god with an explosive temper whose default reaction to being ignored was tidal waves, storms, and sea monsters the size of islands. One wrong word, one slight to his sacred cattle, one accidental drowning of a minor sea nymph, and your coastal city was looking at total destruction. Ask Odysseus, who spent 10 extra years wandering the globe, suffering unimaginable horrors. all because he decided to blind Poseidon's son, the Cyclops Polyphemus. A simple moment of self-preservation turned into a decade of divine harassment that wiped out his entire crew. Ares, the god of brutal, bloody warfare, didn't care about strategy or justice. He just loved the screaming and the chaos. If he got bored, he might just nudge two neighboring city-states into a perpetual, mutually assured destruction, turning your simple life into a brutal, endless military draft. The irony of praying was that it didn't offer protection. It offered visibility. When you knelt and offered a sacrifice, you weren't asking a kind father figure for help. You were presenting a petition to a volatile, cosmic bureaucrat who might grant your wish today and strike you down tomorrow just for being in the wrong place. Their favor was less stable than a mud brick in an earthquake. But wait, it gets pettier. It wasn't just the Olympians you had to fear. The forests, the rivers, the mountains, and even the smallest spring bubbled with minor deities, local spirits, nymphs, dryads, and satyrs, all with their own extremely fragile egos and hyperlocal rules. Step on a flower that belonged to a dryad, drink from a spring without asking permission from the naiad, accidentally interrupt a goat dance, and suddenly you're dealing with a localized, targeted curse that turns your hair green or makes your limbs atrophy. Your world was not a safe landscape, it was a minefield of divine triggers, where piety only ensured you died with your hands clasped in prayer, and ignorance guaranteed you offended someone vastly more powerful than you could ever comprehend. Next, we dive into the terrifying business of what happens when the gods require human interaction, the quests, the curses, and the inescapable terror of being chosen. You thought anonymity was your armor. You thought blending into the dusty, sun-baked landscape of ancient Greece would keep the Olympian spotlight off your fragile, fleeting existence. Wrong. The second a god's eye drifts your way, whether in capricious curiosity or burning malice, your life's lease is immediately revoked, often without warning and always without appeal. It's not an honor to be noticed. It's a cosmic draft notice. You are now a piece on their massive celestial chessboard, and the rules are not only rigged, but they are constantly being rewritten by the players who can destroy the entire board with a single thunderbolt if they feel like it. You are disposable, utterly disposable, and your greatest ambition should have been to die unnoticed in your sleep, clutching a jar of cheap olive oil. But the gods often required entertainment, or vengeance, or, worst of all, an errand boy. And that is how the mortal nightmare of the quest began. These were not opportunities for glory. They were divine tests designed by beings who do not understand fatigue, pain, or the finality of death. These assignments were, invariably, impossible, engineered to fail or succeed at such a devastating personal cost that victory felt indistinguishable from ruin. The labors were his penance, dictated by a petty king named Eurystheus, who was essentially just a terrified puppet on a string pulled by Hera's celestial spite. That wasn't a hero's journey. It was divine, enforced community service with lethal consequences, where every success only deepened a hatred of Olympus's most powerful female. Every time a mortal was given a quest, it meant confronting something that defied natural law. A hydra whose heads grew back faster than you could cut them, a journey through the underworld to steal a three-headed dog, or an attempt to retrieve an item from a god who would surely retaliate. The stakes were always the same: succeed and live, or fail and face eternal torment. but often success just meant delaying the inevitable next catastrophe. Consider poor Bellerophon. He achieved the unthinkable. He tamed Pegasus. He killed the Chimera, the ultimate victory of man over beast. But the moment he allowed ambition to swell his mortal heart, daring to fly Pegasus up toward the sacred heights of Olympus, Zeus swatted him down like a fly, not even bothering to kill him outright. Instead, Bellerophon was crippled and alone, doomed to wander the earth, shunned by gods and men alike, until he died in utter obscurity. Your success is only tolerated until it inconveniences a god's ego, and your peak achievement is just a high ledge from which the Olympians can drop you. But direct quests were almost preferable to the silent, terrifying power of the arbitrary curse. This wasn't about justice. It was about wounded vanity and perceived slights. Did you forget to leave a sufficiently expensive offering on the altar? Did your daughter, perhaps, gasp, claim her weaving skills were better than Athena's? That was the fatal, tiny mistake of Arachne. A simple, talented weaver, she dared to challenge the goddess of craft. Athena's response? Not a friendly competition, but a psychotic transformation, turning Arachne into the first spider, destined to weave forever in eternal misery and horror. A slight against artistic pride led to the birth of an entire species of creeping, crawling terror. And then there was Sisyphus. He didn't challenge a god's power. He challenged their intellect. He outsmarted death itself twice. A clever mortal, a genuine genius of trickery. Did Zeus applaud his ingenuity? Absolutely not. Zeus condemned him to the lowest depths of Tartarus, forced to roll a massive boulder up a hill, only to watch it fall down for all eternity. The gods ensure that even your most brilliant victories and your greatest displays of wit will be inverted into your perpetual, meaningless torture. Immortality was not a reward. It was the ultimate weapon used against you. But perhaps the single most terrifying way to interact with the gods was simply to be beautiful. If you caught the roving, predatory eye of Zeus, you signed your own death warrant and that of your entire extended family. His lust was not romance, it was a cosmic force of destruction, and his wife, Hera, was the ultimate collateral damage specialist, a goddess fueled by an eternal, burning rage directed at the innocent. Leda, Europa, Io, Danae. They were all victims of Zeus's profound inability to keep it in his celestial pants, and every single one paid a devastating, life-altering price. Io, transformed into a white heifer, was forced to wander the earth, eternally pursued and stung by a gadfly sent by the infuriated Hera, never finding rest, never finding peace. Her identity was stripped, her peace abolished, her life ruined, all because she was attractive to the king of the gods. Being a half-blood, a demigod, was no better. It meant you were automatically a target, either by the monsters who could smell the divine blood, or by the jealous deities who saw your existence as a living, breathing testament to Zeus's infidelity. Your life was a ticking time bomb, destined to either die young in a glorious, pointless battle, or be consumed by divine jealousy. The existential truth of mortal life in Greek mythology is this: you are either irrelevant and die anonymously, or you are relevant and die horribly, having served a divine purpose you never understood, your suffering amplified for maximum dramatic effect. The gods did not simply rule the sky and the earth, they dictated your very breath and the finality of your suffering. Every earthquake, every plague, every failed harvest was a direct message, a temper tantrum broadcast from Olympus that mortals were forced to endure, with zero ability to fight back or even comprehend the source of their pain. All you could do was pray, knowing full well that your prayers were likely just annoying the deity you were addressing. The terror was absolute. And yet, in this world defined by divine cruelty, there was one final, chilling destination that awaited every mortal soul, a place where the gods' power extended even past the boundaries of life itself, the suffocating, silent darkness of Hades' realm. Next, we plunge into the Greek afterlife, a place so bleak, where the heroes of old actively begged to return to the misery of life on Earth. Get ready, because the underworld was the final, terrifying punchline of your brief, brutal mortal existence. It turns out, even death couldn't save you from the gods. You thought dying was the escape, the final curtain drop on the drama orchestrated by the capricious Olympian family. Wrong. Death was merely the administrative transfer of your suffering from one cosmic filing cabinet to another, run by a god even more ancient and less forgiving, Hades himself, the ultimate silent landlord of the dead. When your last, rattling breath escaped your lips, the first horror began, the separation of the psyche, the soul, which instantly became a shivering, insubstantial shade, destined to begin the absolute worst road trip in history across the plains of nothingness. This wasn't salvation, this was mandatory processing. You had better hope your surviving family members remembered the ancient custom, the one rule that mattered more than any prayer while you lived, placing a single coin, an obol, beneath your tongue before burial. This was not a suggestion. It was life or eternal, screaming death, depending on how you look at it. Because if they forgot that single copper piece, the fare demanded by the eternally cranky ferryman Charon, you were trapped. Trapped forever on the bleak, windswept shores of the river Acheron, watching others pass into the land of the dead, while you wandered eternally unmoored, a spectral beggar with no hope of rest. Imagine the ultimate FOMO, but it lasts for millennia, freezing and screaming until your essence dissolved into nothingness, all because of one overlooked coin. The gods ensured your fate hinged on the trivial memory of a grief-stricken relative, magnifying their power through pure, agonizing bureaucracy. If you paid Charon, congratulations. Your torture just got upgraded from waiting in line to being seated at the worst dinner party ever. You were ferried across the swampy, soul-chilling waters, entering the true domain of the dead, protected by layers of dread and geography designed specifically to crush any residual hope. There was the river Styx, the boundary of worlds, where even the gods feared to swear falsely, a current of pure, ancient power that made you feel even smaller than you were in life. There was Cocytus, the river of wailing, echoing with the moans of every person who had ever lived and regretted it, a sound that never faded. And guarding the entrance, the last truly unbreakable barrier, was the legendary three-headed nightmare, Cerberus, whose teeth dripped venom, and whose job description was simple: keep them in, keep the living out. Any attempt to escape resulted in being devoured by a beast whose diet consisted purely of terrified souls. Most people, And let's be clear, 99.9% of you pathetic mortals did not go to Elysium, the paradise reserved for heroes and demigods blessed by the gods, a highly exclusive club whose standards were impossibly high and mostly arbitrary. You ended up in the field of asphodel. This wasn't fire or torture. It was far, far worse. It was the absolute soul-numbing nothing, the ultimate anticlimax after a life of constant terror and suffering. The gods couldn't even be bothered to make your punishment interesting. Think of the most boring Sunday afternoon you've ever experienced. Stretch that feeling across eternity, remove all memory of why you exist, and force yourself to wander a desolate gray meadow, eating only tasteless, ghostly flowers. This was your reward for a life of honest toil and fear, eternal, meaningless wandering, existing as an echo. The shade of Achilles himself, when visited by Odysseus, declared that he would rather be a slave to the poorest farmer on earth than be a king among the dead. That tells you everything you need to know about the quality of the afterlife provided by the Olympians. But then there were the truly special cases, the ones who had dared to slight a god, or worse, try to outsmart them. Their punishments were not just suffering, they were cosmic performance art, designed by the gods to remind every spirit in the underworld just who was in charge and why you should have kept your head down. Take Sisyphus, the clever king who thought he could cheat Thanatos, the personification of death itself, by binding him with chains. His reward? Pushing a massive boulder up an impossibly steep hill, only for it to crash down just as it reached the summit, forever, a loop of physical and psychological futility that never breaks. Or Tantalus, who dared to steal the gods' nectar and ambrosia, the divine foodstuff, believing he could get away with the ultimate crime. His torment was crafted by Hades with exquisite psychological cruelty, perfectly tailored to his mortal cravings. He stood in a pool of water that recedes when he tries to drink, and beneath fruit that lifts just as he reaches for it. Eternal thirst, eternal hunger. The gods don't just kill you, they turn your greatest need into your eternal prison, a showcase of divine sadism. You were stripped of identity, reduced to an echo of your former self, forever trapped in the cold, unfeeling bureaucracy of the Lord of the Dead, a silent ruler whose power was absolute and whose judgments were final. And the best part? There was no redemption, no appeal process, no escape clause. The terror of Zeus's lightning bolt was instant. The terror of Hades' judgment was forever. You were truly powerless, a cosmic footnote suffering in the gray silence, waiting for the next whim of an immortal being that couldn't even be bothered to look down at you. And if you thought the terrors stopped at death, you haven't accounted for the things that stalked the mortal world before you died, the monsters and prophecies that ensured your life was a living nightmare, the creatures designed purely to make your brief flicker of existence a painful, bloody mess. The very geography of the ancient world was less a reliable map and more a divine obstacle course designed for maximum mortal attrition. If the gods weren't directly smiting you with a bolt of celestial fury, they were ensuring the landscape itself was weaponized against your fragile existence, turning every trade route into a potential blood sacrifice. You didn't just worry about routine disasters like famine or flood. You worried about the entire region dissolving into volcanic ash because Hephaestus had a particularly stressful Tuesday at the forge. This wasn't just farming or sailing. This was a daily, terrifying gamble against seismic activity and atmospheric conditions powered entirely by the moody, unpredictable whims of Olympus. Every remote canyon and overgrown forest held a beast whose parentage was either a drunken fling between a minor deity and a mountain nymph, or a failed biology experiment by some forgotten titan. And they were all eternally, viciously hungry for mortal flesh. Let's talk about the specific, recurring nightmares that made travel a guaranteed death sentence. Take the Sphinx, that riddle-loving psycho who guarded the gates of Thebes. She wasn't just a monster, she was a cosmic troll, put there by the vengeful gods, Hera usually, to ensure that no one actually had a decent, peaceful commute. One wrong answer to her deceptively simple query, and you were instantly torn limb from limb and consumed. But here is the truly messed up part. The riddle wasn't just a tough brain teaser, it was a cosmic trap. The deities, or the cold fates themselves, placed these impossible, unsolvable problems, knowing that 99% of humanity wouldn't stand a chance. It was systematic, targeted population control, disguised as a philosophy quiz designed to make your final moments excruciating. Your death was predetermined by the sheer intellectual arrogance of the gods, who demanded clarity of thought from beings whose brains were constantly addled by fear, plague, and famine. You died not because you were stupid, but because the universe demanded high-stakes dramatic tension. And if you somehow managed to survive the thinking monsters, you ran straight into the brute force nightmares. Consider the Lernaean Hydra, an absolute biological atrocity. You thought you solved the problem by lopping off one of its heads? Congratulations, you just created 3 more problems, each with sharper teeth and exponentially worse venom, multiplied by 9, guaranteeing your death was agonizingly slow and messy. It was the ultimate, cruel metaphor for mortal effort. The harder you tried to fix your cursed life, the exponentially worse the disaster became. It was the ultimate, cruel metaphor for mortal effort. The harder you tried to fix your cursed life, the exponentially worse the disaster became. You spend years cultivating a field, trying to feed your family, only for a colossal man-eating boar sent by an annoyed Artemis because some local village idiot didn't sacrifice enough rabbits to destroy your entire livelihood in one night. You were trying to build civilization on quicksand powered by divine petty spite, and that quicksand was also full of teeth. But perhaps the deepest cut, the most potent existential weapon against the mortal soul, wasn't the lightning bolt or the gashing teeth, but the inescapable, soul-crushing certainty of the future, prophecy. If you were truly spectacularly unlucky, your birth came with a detailed, binding spoiler alert from the fates, and it was never, ever a pleasant forecast. It was always, you will inadvertently kill your father and marry your mother, or your fleeting beauty will cause a 10-year war that wipes out half of the known world and you won't be able to stop it. You were born carrying a ticking time bomb of unavoidable, predetermined tragedy, a script written in stone by bored, weaving goddesses who absolutely adored a good catastrophe and refused to rewrite the ending. Even if you tried to run, even if you sailed across the perilous sea, changed your name to something generic like Bob the Farmer, and became a recluse in a remote valley, The universal laws themselves were contractually obligated to steer you back toward your gruesome, televised destiny. The stars literally aligned against your free will, demanding compliance with your doom. And then there was justice, or the monstrous lack thereof. Did you commit an actual unforgivable crime? Did you accidentally disrespect a god while drunk on cheap wine? Prepare for the Furies, the three terrifying snake-haired manifestations of divine guilt and vengeance. These weren't rational police officers. They were relentless, supernatural, existential stalkers who specialized in pure, agonizing psychological horror. They drove you mad with relentless physical and mental torment until you either died from exhaustion and fear or begged for eternal oblivion, which was often granted, but not before they thoroughly enjoyed every second of the spectacle. They specialized in non-stop 24. 7. Psychological warfare, whispering your worst failures, deepest shames, and accidental trespasses directly into your brain until every waking moment was a personalized, inescapable hellscape of self-loathing. And who sent them? The very same Olympians who routinely committed incest, mass murder, infidelity, and betrayal on a scale that dwarfed any mortal crime known to man. The hypocrisy of the cosmic system was so thick, so pervasive, you could literally drown in the sheer unfairness of it all, gasping for air in a sea of divine double standards. You were trapped in a mythological prison where morality was a meaningless concept, where the laws of nature were merely the casual, contradictory whims of powerful, petulant giants who needed drama to fuel their eternal, selfish lives. Every breath, every meal, every journey, every declaration of love was a risk that could accidentally offend an immortal, trigger a catastrophic curse, or unleash a forgotten monster that the gods had carelessly misplaced millennia ago. Your brief, pain-riddled life was nothing but background noise in the ultimate cosmic soap opera, and your suffering was the necessary, terrifying, dramatic tension required to keep the celestial audience thoroughly entertained. You existed solely to scream beautifully for an audience of uncaring immortals. That was your sole purpose. And the worst part, even death offered no immediate escape, only a change of venue to the equally depressing and often monitored realm of Hades. But that terrifying transition is a horror story for another time. The mortal world before you died was already engineered for maximum, inescapable suffering. We talked about Zeus, the cosmic alpha predator, and Hera, the shadow of vengeance. But the terror didn't stop at Olympus's peak. It radiated outward, a pervasive, suffocating smog of divine malice that settled over every olive grove and every fisherman's boat. Being mortal meant navigating a minefield so vast, so intricately wired with divine egos, that simply waking up was an act of staggering defiance against overwhelming cosmic odds. Think of it like this. Zeus was the nuclear deterrent, rarely deployed but always looming. But the daily threats? Those came from the mid-level management of the pantheon, the demigods, the nymphs, and the thousands of local deities who held petty grudges like priceless relics. You might think, I'll just stay inside. You fool. If you were a sailor, you had to appease Poseidon, but also the dozens of Nereids who decided whether your mast snapped or your cargo stayed dry. Poseidon's rage was legendary, capable of swallowing entire fleets because one priest forgot to sacrifice a bull, or because some arrogant hero claimed he was a better swimmer than a sea sprite. The land was no safer. Every spring, every forest, every mountain peak belonged to someone impossibly powerful and impossibly touchy. Imagine crossing the boundary of a dryad's grove. You didn't just step on a daisy, you committed a capital offense against a being older than your civilization, capable of twisting your bones into the roots of the very tree you defiled. Your punishment? Not death, which would be merciful, but an agonizing, slow transformation, a silent scream entombed in bark. This leads us to the most insidious rule of mortal life, the law of hubris. You hear that word and you think it means arrogance, boasting to the gods. No, no, no. That's the sanitized version. In the true, bone-chilling reality of the Olympian regime, hubris simply meant attracting attention. It was the crime of competence. If you were too beautiful, you offended Aphrodite, or drew the ravenous eye of a satyr who had no concept of consent, and the gods wouldn't lift a finger to save you. If you were too good at weaving, like poor Arachne, you invited Athena's deadly envious contest, knowing the consequence of victory was oblivion. If you built a wall too strong or designed a machine too clever, Hephaestus might smile, but his jealousy was a slow-burning fire that eventually consumed everything you loved. But sometimes, the gods didn't even need you to slip up. They just needed to use you as a pawn in their celestial chess match. This brings us to the agonizing paradox of prophecy. The Oracle of Delphi was supposed to offer clarity, a glimpse into the tapestry woven by the fates. But the information was never straightforward. It was always a razor-sharp trap designed to ensure that the very act of trying to avoid the prophecy was the exact mechanism that fulfilled it. But his attempt to escape destiny was the key that unlocked it. Oedipus survived, was adopted, and grew up unaware of his parentage. When he later met a proud stranger on the road, his real father, and killed him in a fit of rage, and then married the widowed queen, his real mother, he fulfilled the decree to the letter. The prophecy wasn't a warning, it was a blueprint, and the human desire to survive was merely the executioner. Mortals were not active participants in their lives. They were the unfortunate actors bound by an invisible, unbreakable script written in the stars, where the climax was always their utter destruction. And as if this wasn't enough, the gods had another way to remind you of your insignificance, the curse of the immortal memory. When a god punished you, it was often not just an act of violence, but an act of rewriting reality, turning you into a cautionary tale. Your suffering became part of their eternal lore. You became the whispering stream, forever running from a lustful deity. You became the constellation, pinned eternally against the velvet blackness, a shiny, glamorous reminder of your excruciating downfall. Your failure was elevated, celebrated, and used to frighten every subsequent generation. You lost your life, your identity, and your legacy was transformed into a divine joke. No peace in life, and no quiet dignity in your eternal, transformed afterlife. This was the true terror of the Greek cosmos, and there was absolutely no escape. You thought the terror of transformation was the worst fate? That being turned into a weeping willow or a star constellation was the peak of divine cruelty? Oh, my friend, you were only looking at the consequences, not the architect of your suffering. The gods might deliver the punishment, but there was a council far older, far colder, and utterly devoid of mercy that dictated the script of your demise before your parents even met. The true existential dread for the Greek mortal wasn't just Zeus's temper. It was the chilling, inescapable knowledge that your entire life was a predetermined sentence, woven thread by agonizing thread by the Moirai, the three sisters of fate. These were not gods you could appeal to, not deities you could bribe with 100 oxen or a golden shrine. Clotho spun the thread of your life. Lachesis measured its exact, agonizing length. And then there was Atropos, the inevitable one, who simply waited with her shears, ready to snip the cord at the precise, pre-scheduled moment of your doom. Imagine living every waking second knowing that the exact number of your heartbeats was already counted, that every success was merely a detour on the highway to your catastrophic failure. You were less a sentient being and more a spool of yarn being manipulated by three ancient blind seamstresses who felt nothing but the rhythmic pull of necessity. If the Moirai dictated the length of your thread, the great oracles of the land, Delphi, Dodona, were simply the heralds who announced the specific, terrible patterns woven into it. The most devastating prophecies were the ones that forced mortals to act against their own interests, driving them insane in the desperate attempt to avoid the very fate they were destined to fulfill. Think of Oedipus, the classic case study in cosmic futility. A prophecy foretold he would kill his father and marry his mother. Did he accept this and resign himself to misery? No, he fled, dedicating his life to defying the decree of the cosmos. And what was the result? Every step he took away from Corinth, every choice he made in honorable desperation was merely the next meticulous stitch in the horrific tapestry already laid out. His flight was the catalyst for the murder of his father at a crossroads. His heroism in solving the Sphinx's riddle was the very thing that earned him the crown and the hand of his unwitting mother. The sheer sadistic irony of the prophetic trap meant that your will, your intelligence, your moral choices, they were all meaningless stage dressing for a tragedy written in stone millennia ago. Your free will was merely the illusion that made your downfall feel like your own fault. And what about the heroes? The ones who truly tried to make a difference? The great adventurers who sought glory. They suffered the most spectacular, drawn-out punishments. The gods didn't just ruin ordinary lives. They took the greatest mortals and turned them into performance art for Olympus. Heracles, the strongest man who ever lived, was driven mad by Hera, forced to commit the most heinous acts against his own family, only to spend the rest of his existence cleaning up the universe's garbage as penance. His strength was the engine of his misery. Achilles, the greatest warrior, was forced to watch his best friend die because of his own pride. And then, after achieving unparalleled glory, he was killed by an arrow guided by a god into the single tiny spot of vulnerability his divine protection had missed. Glory in Greece was just a spotlight focused on your eventual, painful death. Even when you escaped the land and the sky, there was the sea, the domain of the earth-shaker, Poseidon. If Zeus was temperamental, Poseidon was outright chaotic, defined by a crushing, indifferent power that made any sea journey a dice roll with oblivion. Mortals relied on the sea for trade, for survival, but to Poseidon, your little ships were floating splinters, and your prayers were bothersome static. He didn't need a slight or a blasphemy to obliterate a fleet. Sometimes he just felt like stirring the waters. The fate of the legendary Odysseus wasn't determined by great battles against armies, but by the relentless 10-year vendetta of a single offended god who merely enjoyed playing with the sailor until he was a broken shell of a man. Every storm, every whirlpool, every terrifying monster encountered was simply Poseidon's personal joke. So, you were either a pawn in a pre-written tragedy dictated by the fates, a target of Poseidon's bored rage on the open sea, or a sacrificial lamb to Eris's thirst for blood. And if by some miracle you survived all that, achieved great fame, or built a beautiful city, that was the most dangerous position of all. Because success, wealth, happiness, any hint that a mortal life could approach the divine level of comfort was immediately branded as the cardinal sin of hubris. You existed too loudly, you attracted too much attention, and Olympus simply could not allow the cosmic order to be challenged by the fleeting success of a creature made of dust. The universe was designed to ensure that every single mortal life was a cosmic punchline, ending in agony or eternal humiliation. There was no dignity, only the inevitable, brutal reckoning. You had already accepted the terror of the sky, the lightning bolts, and the jealous, burning eyes watching from Mount Olympus. But mortals often forgot that the heavens were only 1/3 of the cosmic danger, only one seat of unpredictable, world-ending rage. The ocean, the deep, churning heart of the world, was run by a god whose temper was less predictable than a drunken storm front, a primal force barely contained by the constraints of Olympus itself. Poseidon, the earth-shaker, was a force of pure geological terror, and his preferred method of executing mortals was less personalized vengeance and more collateral mass casualty. Imagine building your entire life, your civilization, your docks, your fishing fleets, right on the edge of his kingdom. Every single wave, every ripple in the bay, was a breath he might decide to stop taking or violently exhale, extinguishing your entire lineage in salt and chaos. When Poseidon was insulted, which happened daily because mortals were inherently clumsy, forgetful, and disrespectful, entire cities vanished beneath the waves in minutes, pulled down into the abyssal darkness without ceremony or warning. His rage was the physical manifestation of nature turning against you, the ultimate betrayal of the solid ground beneath your feet. You might offer the most lavish sacrifices to Zeus, appease Hera with golden trinkets, but if you forgot to throw an extra ox into the foam for Poseidon, your homeland could become Atlantis overnight, a cautionary tale whispered by surviving sailors. Look at Minos of Crete, a king who thought he was clever, a man who believed he could outsmart the god of the deepest blue. He asked Poseidon for a sign of divine favor, a magnificent bull for sacrifice, promising to repay the favor immediately upon receipt. Poseidon, ever the showman and always willing to test the limits of mortal devotion, delivered the beast, pure white, massive, a creature of staggering beauty and power. But King Minos, staring at that perfect specimen, let human greed, that fatal flaw, win out over cosmic terror. He substituted a lesser, more common bull for the sacrifice, thinking the god of the sea wouldn't notice a tiny sleight of hand in the grand scheme of things, believing his earthly crown somehow shielded him from divine scrutiny. He was horrifyingly, cataclysmically wrong. Poseidon did not just notice. He took the insult personally, viewing it as a direct challenge to his dominion and his expectations of mortal obedience, an act of supreme disrespect that demanded a punishment tailored for exquisite, lingering suffering. His revenge was not swift, clean death, which would have been merciful and swift. His revenge was psychological and biological horror, a terrifying masterpiece of humiliation designed to make the king suffer for generations until the very memory of his kingdom was tainted by monstrosity. He cursed Minos's wife, Pasiphae, with an unnatural, burning lust for that very same magnificent bull, a passion so overwhelming it drove her to madness and bestiality. This wasn't just infidelity. This was a cosmic violation of nature, resulting in the birth of the Minotaur, the horrifying half-man, half-bull monster that would consume Athenian youth for years inside its winding labyrinth. A simple lie about a cow sacrifice, a petty act of mortal economy, led to decades of human sacrifice and the ultimate downfall of a glorious maritime kingdom. That is the cost of saving a cow when Poseidon is watching, and it illustrates the terrifying, disproportionate response that defined the mortal experience. But perhaps the most insidious, soul-crushing terror of being a mortal under Olympus was the concept of the inherited curse, the venom that seeped into the bloodlines. You didn't even have to be the one to offend the deity or commit the unforgivable crime. You could be born generations later, completely innocent of any wrongdoing, only to find yourself swimming in the poisoned, agonizing fallout of some ancient, forgotten slight committed by your great-great-grandfather. Think of the house of Atreus, the definition of a dysfunctional family, but with divine, endless consequences, a family tree whose roots drank only spilled blood. You had no chance to escape this genetic destiny. When you were born into a cursed lineage, your entire life became a pre-written tragedy, and your choices were merely the specific methods by which the ancient curse manifested its inevitable conclusion. Did you choose to murder your mother, or was the curse the true author of the action, merely using your hand as a passive, helpless tool? The existential horror was absolute. Your moral compass was irrelevant. Your piety meant nothing, and your prayers dissolved into the indifferent air. Your destiny was already sealed by the malicious bookkeeping of the cosmos, a debt that could only be paid in the currency of kinslaying. The Furies, the terrifying goddesses of vengeance, were always waiting, specifically targeting those who had spilled familial blood, ensuring the cycle was enforced with cold, ruthless efficiency. They were the ultimate auditors of divine injustice, creatures of pure, relentless consequence, and once they smelled the blood of kin on your hands, your life was over. The Furies would pursue you across oceans and continents, never sleeping, never stopping, until madness or death claimed you, making mortal sleep an impossibility and mortal life a sustained nightmare. This was the mortal experience. You were either immediately crushed by a god's tantrum, or you were slowly, agonizingly consumed by the residual toxic waste of your ancestors' bad decisions. The world wasn't a place of opportunity, it was a waiting room for the next cosmic disaster, a stage where your only role was to suffer beautifully for the amusement of those above, while the gods watched the endless show. You thought the arbitrary rage of the Olympians was the worst of it? You thought that perhaps if you walked the line perfectly, never caught Zeus's wandering eye, and never incurred Hera's endless simmering fury, you might just squeak by with a decent life? Think again. The universe of Greek mythology wasn't just ruled by impulsive, selfish children on Mount Olympus. It was governed by a far more terrifying, absolute force, the ancient, emotionless bureaucracy of fate itself, embodied by the Moirae, or the Fates. These were three entities so ancient, so utterly devoid of empathy, that even Zeus, the great cloud-gatherer, the king of the cosmos, dared not openly cross them. They were the ultimate power above the gods, and their existence meant that your suffering was not just random, it was preordained, woven into the very fabric of existence from the moment you drew your first doomed breath. Clotho spun the thread of your life. Lachesis measured out its length, and let me tell you, for a mortal, that measurement was stingy and insufficient. And then there was Atropos, the one who could not be turned, who held the terrifying shears. Atropos's name literally means she who cannot be turned or avoided. When she decided your story was over, when that specific, pitiful length of thread ran out, there was no appeal, no pleading, no miraculous intervention possible, not even from the most powerful deity. You weren't just a puppet, you were a clockwork toy, whose mechanism was predetermined by three ancient blind women operating in a dark corner of the cosmos, far removed from the petty drama of Olympus, but infinitely more dangerous to your well-being. They set the timeline, they guaranteed the heartache, and they ensured that any attempt you made to evade your destiny would only loop you back into the exact painful path they had prescribed. Oedipus didn't try to marry his mother and murder his father out of spite. He did it trying desperately not to, proving that fate was a cruel, self-fulfilling cosmic joke. And what happened once Atropos made her final cold snip? Where did that thread of suffering lead? To the deepest, darkest, most existentially miserable place in the entire Greek cosmos, the inescapable, eternal gloom of the underworld, ruled by the silent, unyielding King Hades. Forget your modern concepts of heaven or hell, punishment or reward. The Greek afterlife was overwhelmingly characterized by one brutal quality: joylessness. It wasn't a fire pit for the damned, but a vast, sprawling, gray landscape where your reward for a good, pious life was the same reward for an evil, murderous life. An eternity of wandering aimlessly as a shade, devoid of memory, warmth, or purpose. Imagine the existential terror of crossing the river Styx. You had to have the coin, the single obol, placed under your tongue upon burial, just to pay the grumpy, terrifying ferryman Charon. If your family failed this sacred duty, if your body was left unburied on the battlefield, your soul was condemned to wander the bleak shores between worlds for 100 years, forever watching the ferryman take other, luckier shades across the river. This wasn't just bad luck. This was the ultimate failure of mortal duty, leading to an eternal, lonely purgatory before your actual eternity of gray misery could even begin. And once you were across, you faced the three judges, Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus, who determined your specific flavor of dull despair. Were you spectacularly awful? Did you commit crimes against the gods or against humanity on a grand scale? Then congratulations, you earned a VIP pass to Tartarus, the deepest pit, reserved for the truly horrific. This is where the legends of Sisyphus and Tantalus originated, and let me tell you, their punishment defined the ultimate cosmic cruelty. Sisyphus, cursed to push a massive boulder up a hill only to have it roll down just as he reached the summit, forever embodied eternal, pointless labor. Tantalus, who tried to trick the gods into cannibalism, was doomed to eternal thirst and hunger, standing in water that receded when he bent to drink, and under fruit that drifted away when he reached for it. These were not quick deaths. These were personalized, finely tuned mechanisms of perpetual frustration and agony designed by the gods themselves. But even if you were good, even if you were heroic, your reward in Elysium, the supposed paradise, was often just slightly less boring than the asphodel meadows, where the average shades drifted. It was a place of eternal, mild, green comfort, but utterly lacking the vibrancy, the sun, or the deep, complex passions of the mortal world you left behind. To be a shade was to be a whisper, a husk, a ghost of a person, permanently diminished and utterly cut off from the light of the living. Even the greatest heroes, when visited by mortals, lamented their fate, preferring the life of the poorest field hand above ground to the meaningless eternity of the underworld. So, the mortal perspective was truly awful. Live under the constant, arbitrary threat of divine destruction, knowing your thread was spun by indifferent fates, and your only guaranteed destination was a gray, joyless eternity that no amount of virtue could significantly improve. You were born to suffer, and you died only to suffer perpetually in silence, a cosmic footnote in the endless, dark epic of the gods. We've spent much time charting the chaotic, explosive dangers of the Olympians, Zeus throwing electric tantrums, Poseidon shaking the foundations of the world, and Hera simply enjoying the endless, pointless slaughter of your entire bloodline. But those, terrifying as they were random events, sudden storms you might just, by some miracle of luck, survive. What if I told you that the deepest source of mortal suffering was something far colder, far more inevitable, a primal, existential terror that struck with absolute, relentless mathematical precision? The greatest agony in the mortal world wasn't the capricious anger of the gods, but the grim, undeniable truth that everything was already decided, pre-programmed for pain and despair. Your life wasn't a journey of choice or virtue. It was a devastating, pre-written script, penned in cold, absolute blood by three entities who cared nothing for your prayers, your sacrifice, or your crushing, inevitable suffering. These were the Moira, the Fates, and they held the true, ultimate power of the cosmos, a power that even the mighty Zeus feared to challenge. They were Clotho, Lachesis, and Atropos, and they were the cosmic timekeepers, the weavers of reality itself. Zeus could throw 100 lightning bolts, but he couldn't snip a single thread they spun. Clotho was the spinner, initiating your existence, determining when and where you would be born into this pitiless world. Lachesis was the measurer, deciding the exact length and destiny of that thread, which meant defining the precise quantity of misery, hardship, and betrayal you were allotted before your final breath. And then the true horror, Atropos. She was the inflexible, cold administrator of the end. She held the giant, terrifying shears, and when she cut your thread, that was it. No bargaining, no pleading, no desperate Olympian interference could stop her work. She was the final, unyielding wall of darkness, and her decision was the one law of the universe that could never be broken or amended. Imagine learning, through the chilling pronouncements of an oracle, that your entire existence was a predetermined, inescapable horror show designed solely for tragedy. This was the crushing curse of prophecy in the ancient Greek world, and it created a specific, torturous kind of existential dread that haunts us to this day. When a prophecy dropped, it wasn't a warning you could avoid. It was a cosmic iron cage snapping shut around your entire life. And the truly demonic part of this divine game? The harder you fought the prophecy, the faster you ran from the predicted doom, the more certainly you ran headlong into it. Take the legendary example of King Laius, who received the worst news possible. His son would grow up to kill him and marry his own mother, the queen. That very act of desperate cruelty, meant to defy the will of the fates, was the precise mechanism fate used to ensure the prophecy was fulfilled, not avoided. That abandoned baby, Oedipus, lived, was adopted by another royal house, and grew up completely ignorant of his true parents and the horrifying destiny Lachesis have measured out for him. The threads pulled taut. He solved the Sphinx's riddle, became the celebrated king of Thebes, and married the recently widowed Queen Jocasta, his own mother. The entire catastrophic, civilization-destroying domino chain was set off by the desperate attempt to stop the very first domino from falling. You see, the fates don't allow detours. They only allow the most dramatic possible route to the predetermined conclusion. This wasn't just individual bad luck either. The fates didn't deal only in singular tragedies. They dealt in mass extinction events cleverly disguised as heroic epics. Think about the decade-long soul-crushing bloodbath that was the Trojan War, a conflict that annihilated an entire generation of Greek men and brought the great city of Troy to ashes. Why did that war start? Because of a beauty contest judged by a single foolish mortal prince, Paris, who was promised the most beautiful woman in the world, Helen, as a bribe. But the true, terrifying engine of that slaughter was destiny, meticulously woven and decreed centuries before. The gods, knowing the fates demanded a certain violent reduction of the mortal population and the inevitable, bloody end of the Age of Heroes, allowed that contest to proceed, manipulating the petty jealousies of Hera and Aphrodite. If you were a common soldier in the Greek camp or an average citizen hiding behind the besieged walls of Troy, did you care about Helen's face or Paris's poor judgment? No. You cared that your farm was burning, your family was starving, and your body was about to be cut down by a bronze sword wielded by some doomed, equally miserable mortal on the other side. You were just a piece of kindling, a non-sentient prop in the grand, predetermined bonfire of cosmic history. Your entire existence was only relevant insofar as it served to fulfill a single brutal line in the Moira's terrible, unchanging manuscript. And consider the fate of those who survived the war, the exhausted, traumatized survivors who faced the inevitable, predetermined nostos, the doomed journey home. Odysseus, the cleverest, most cunning man alive, took 10 years to return to Ithaca, facing every predetermined storm, every vengeful god, and every monstrous obstacle, all because the length of his journey was measured out by the relentless thread Lachesis had spun long ago. The fates guaranteed that no amount of cunning, strength, or virtue could change the length of that thread. You could potentially dodge a lightning bolt or negotiate with a jealous god, but you could never, ever dodge the cold, inevitable snip of Atropos's shears. You didn't truly live your life. You merely enacted the terrible, pre-written script, utterly powerless spectators to your own unavoidable cosmic doom. And that crushing realization of absolute helplessness, more than any divine curse or monster's hunger, was the truest, most debilitating terror of being a mortal in ancient Greece.